Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about our history. History is a fascinating thing that's shared with a lot of us who like history, have studied history, taught history, or just being an armchair historian who loves to follow history. It's a fascinating and amazing thing, full of great stories and full of tales. And in history, we have to understand that a lot of the stories that are told are just that, stories. There are great moments in our history, and there are moments in our history that really aren't that important, but have been made important to raise someone up in history to make them look far better. If we just start with the beginning of this country, it's a fascinating story. There's so many aspects to it. Of course, we had a revolution of sorts, if you can call it that. It was more of breaking away from a nation where we were seceding, actually. And it's a fascinating thing when you think about it. When we come to the time of the American Civil War, the South considered they were doing what we did in 1776, and for all intents and purposes, they were correct. But, of course, Lincoln was not going to agree to such a thing, and so he pushed and kept saying Union, Union, the mystic chords of memory, that kind of stuff. All of these things were about saying that we've always had a union. And of course, we haven't always had a union. And I want to explain that to you for a little while here, because it takes a little explaining to make sense of a lot of the things that were going on in this country, if you want to call it a country even, during the American Revolution. And so the revolution kind of started rather slowly and worked its way to becoming something pretty bad by the early 1770s. There was a lot of actions and a lot of arguments and problems going on in Boston. In Boston, it was a hotbed of activity. And of course, you had the Boston Massacre. Was it a massacre? No. Was it a riot? Yes. Were the soldiers to blame? Not really. And who started the whole mess? The rioters were throwing snowballs with rocks in them. They had clubs. They were hitting the soldiers. They were screaming at the soldiers, who were terrified. There was only a handful of them, and there was a whole mob around them with clubs and rocks and everything else. And they were screaming, fire, fire, in the melee, and finally a gun went off, followed by a whole bunch of others. And then they blamed the soldiers for bullying the crowd. Now, if you take a look at this, you realize that it's absolute poppycock. That those soldiers were not the villains, but the crowd was. And unfortunately, some of them were killed and they became martyrs, and they were used in propaganda and calling it the Boston Massacre. And you see the pictures, you see them, the soldiers calmly firing into the crowd. That's not the case at all. The soldiers were backed up to a wall with people marching toward them with rocks and clubs and everything else. It's a lot different than it's made out to be. Of course, everyone wanted to have them killed for their terrible actions. And a young Boston lawyer came in and said, no, I will defend them. His name was John Adams, and everybody absolutely hated John Adams for that action. But why did John Adams do it? Because John Adams' belief was to be fair and honest. They used to call him Honest John. That was his nickname. He was honest to a fault, and that was one of his great weaknesses, actually, in many respects. But he defended those soldiers and he saved them from the gallows, much to the anger of a lot of people in Boston. But the Boston Massacre isn't. It is a massive piece of propaganda. And every war has propaganda, okay? And then, of course, we started having the battles, conquered Lexington, and finally Bunker Hill, which was Breed's Hill at the time. And those were Minutemen, which we'll talk about a little later. And so by the time of our emergence as becoming a country, the Declaration of Independence, independence was declared July 4th, 1776. No. It was declared July 2nd, 1776. The 4th is the day the printer took care of the printing. That's why it's the 4th. I hate to say it, that's about the only reason that the 4th of July is celebrated, is because the printer put the 4th on the paper and not the 2nd. But in our history, July 2nd is Independence Day. And we agreed to become a nation. Well, we kind of agreed to become a nation. It was a loosely fitted confederation. That's exactly what it was in many respects. What's kind of interesting as well is they agreed to sign the proclamation, the Declaration of Independence, to rid themselves of tyranny from the British government. And the war was started. In fact, the war had been started a year before we declared independence, if you think about it. And then, of course, time after time after time, we had our battles, we had our wars, The fantastic portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware is magnificent. It wasn't done by anybody in the United States, it was done by a German, which it hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Magnificent painting. I mean, it's not accurate in the regard of what was used, but the premise of it is so vitally important. And in that case, if you think about it, it states a fact that actually happened. It states something that actually happened. It's not exactly accurate. We didn't have a flag yet. At least not the flag that's shown in that. And of course, it was a battle with the Hessians. And of course, the Hessians fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered, and we had more guns, etc., and they were captured. It was a fortunate thing, because had that not gone well, it might have been the end of the little battle, because Washington was in New York, and that was a disaster area. I mean, it's like trying to defend like an edge of New Orleans. It was just, it just wasn't an area that you could survive in, because all you had to do is bring all the ships around. And of course, Washington was there, and he came in there with a pretty large army and left there with a pretty small one. They were horrendously defeated and saved by several people. Mrs. Murray, and it doesn't get talked about. And it sounds like a myth, Mrs. Murray, but it's actually fact. There's a lot of other things that are myths, but Mrs. Murray is actually a fact. And she was aided by Aaron Burr, which is also a fact, which doesn't get talked about at all. He kind of saved Washington and Hamilton, as it were. And Washington never forgave him for it, Washington's the star. You have to understand that. He was always the star, and everything was the way Washington liked it, and he didn't want someone to ever do something that would upstage him when he was in the act of being the general. And Burr broke that awful rule. So, just to continue here, we have signed a declaration of which 13 individual countries were part of a confederation. This is so very important. Do you realize we had this whole idea of nation? And we weren't. In 1777, we created a feeble constitution called the Articles of Confederation. Now, you have to understand something, that when you have a group react to something they don't like, their reaction will be a mirrored image in many respects, completely opposite to what was. And so what was the Articles of Confederation? It was a makeup of 13 countries, for all intents and purposes. 13 states and a central government that was extremely weak because they were terrified of the tyranny of a strong central government, which is what they had just experienced in England. So they created an extremely feeble central government. And each state, as I mentioned, was a separate country. They had their own currency. They had their own militia. They pushed duties and tariffs on other states. And this was a mess. And there was a lot of infighting going on between the states. And as the war progressed, and finally, when it ended in 1783, not because of our great prowess, but the ability to survive, it was because of France. France is the reason we got our independence. The Battle of Yorktown was basically a large army of French and some American soldiers. And who was on the other side? The British, of course. Cornwallis. And what was surrounding Cornwallis in the water? The French Navy. That's how we got the surrender. It's an interesting thing. It was basically the French who got it for us. Then, of course, we were under the Articles of Confederation. And, of course, there you have your 13 countries who do not agree and who are charging each other amazing amounts of money and tariffs. And each has ambassadors that they're sending to Europe to deal for their country. And things really got rocky. It was the European Union here. And it reached a point where everyone was saying this is all going to fall apart very soon. And this fragile idea of independence was ready to unravel. They were afraid part of this whole confederation will join England again. And so there was a gathering. The first gathering didn't work very well in Annapolis, but there was a gathering in Philadelphia. And what was the gathering for? To restore and fix the Articles of Confederation. That was the purpose. However, there were 4 individuals, 2 New Yorkers and 2 Virginians. George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. You know, I got to look at John Jay's papers at Columbia University. It was fascinating to read some of that stuff and look at it. A brilliant individual. Magnificent and very unsung in many respects as to the size of this country and so many other things that he did. George Washington had no desire whatsoever to be there. And he was kind of pushed along by James Madison, who had become very, very close to Washington at this point of time. And with his constant imploring of saying he, was the only one who could solve the situation. Well, he had resigned, if you think about it already. We used to call him our Cincinnatus, and Cincinnatus was, the Roman general who gave up his job, but never came back, went to farming. But Washington came back, reluctantly. And that is a strong, strong word for Washington. He uses it all the time. When they ask him to do something, he says, I will reluctantly. And he goes there. And everybody's there ready to repair the Articles of Confederation. And these four hijack the whole convention. A lot of people leave. They're pissed off. Patrick Henry, who was a great pusher for our liberty and very happy with the Articles of Confederation. He leaves. A lot of people leave. And they create what is called our Constitution. Totally trash the Articles of Confederation. We don't tell these stories. We don't share this stuff with people, which is unfortunate. And of course we had a flag by then, but of course we always hear the story about Betsy Ross. And I'm sorry, Betsy Ross is as real as the Easter Bunny, okay? Let's be honest. She was created, she wasn't around for a long, long time. If you look at the histories of this country, and you look at all the things that are written in newspapers and whatever, even in Philadelphia, there's not a mention. And then her grandson, like 1869, 1870, suddenly says, you know, my grandmother made the first flag, and George Washington came over and said blah, 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 and they did this. It was complete utter nonsense. But it raised his status in Philadelphia society, and he had a grand old time. The thing is that other members of the family added to the story, and it was incredible. Well, we have to remember something. We had a flag committee in Congress, and they finally adopted a flag in 1777. Now, how in God's name did George Washington in 1775 meet with Betsy Ross and design the flag? It's a nice story. It's uplifting. It's inspiring. But it's good for growing tomatoes, okay? Another part of this is that in all of the battles, look at New York. I mean, that was a terrific battle with Washington. He went in with a large force and went out with a tiny one. He survived barely. And the interesting thing is, what saved Washington was the fact that he had his soldiers who had signed up for a period of time. And they were there. You also had militias. And they left. They didn't like it. Because they wanted to go back to their own country. This was just a battle for creating, they weren't quite sure, actually. Because their country was the big thing. Remember, whatever state they were from, it was their country. They had their currency. They had their militia, their army. And they weren't going to leave their countries. They were going to protect their borders. And if somebody came and attacked their state, then they would fight. So the whole idea of the Minuteman kind of thing, that's kind of interesting, but not exactly correct. And of course, there was a lot of malicious stuff being done too by the Minutemen. They guarded their area, and if you weren't for what they were for, they would, tar and feather you or kill you, whatever it may be. That is a bit of a myth, like Betsy Ross in many respects. As I said, in New England, where all the battles started, you had your militia, and they fought, and they were from that area. But Washington's army were those that signed up, and a good deal of them were African American. Why? Because they were fighting for their freedom. Soldiers were fighting for freedom. And when the whole war was over, they were destroyed financially. They didn't get any kind of pension. They didn't get anything. And so many people who were leaders in the revolution, politicians and spokesmen and financiers, put up all their money to create this nation and ended up in debtor's prison. It's dreadful thing we don't really hear much about, because so many people gave up everything. And so many people ended up with nothing, and they died paupers. It's a pretty pathetic thing when you think about it. Our whole idea of the American Revolution, in many respects, is everybody standing there, arm to arm, singing "Kumbaya." That's not the case at all. Another thing that's kind of interesting is the fact that were we exactly a nation in 1789? No. There were still a lot of issues over states. A lot of the states weren't for the Constitution. They made a deal in the Constitution that basically all they needed was 9 votes. That was what they came up with. It didn't have any fact. It was just something that they decided arbitrarily, that's going to be it. And they got it. And the others were dragged along like Washington reluctantly. But remember this, that the American Revolution, which at the time we had the Articles of Confederation, was a series of countries. And of course, Abraham Lincoln said that we had a union, and used that term union all the time because he didn't dare say it any differently. Because, in reality, they weren't a union. And the South, in its argument against Lincoln, was actually more correct. But of course, in changes of the Constitution after the Civil War, made us a union. And that ceased that whole idea of states as separate entities. And the idea of secession kind of went bye-bye. Yeah, you think about it, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, that's basically the reinvention of the country again, in many respects. And so I've rambled on here about early American history, and I wanted to talk about some of the other people, but obviously I've already talked too long already. But we'll have another talk. I'd like to talk about some of the other leaders and mention some of the things in which they did, which in some cases were great, in some cases were not at all. Thank you.